Okay, good morning everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you here fresh and smiling this morning. NUPI normally have our seminars a bit later, but it's good to start the day a bit earlier. For some of us it cannot start early enough. Today I think we have a very special event. I'm really happy to see the program, and we have very exciting things, and actually it's like Kinder Egg. It's 3 in 1. First, of course, we will have the launch of or presentation of a paper that some of us at NUPI, but also with some other colleagues, Alf Håkon Hoel among them, have written in preparation for the G20 under the Japanese presidency. As some of you know, during the end of this month, the G20 countries will meet in Japan for the summit. The main topic will be, of course, trade frictions and economic governance. But also during the Japanese presidency, G20 they will advocate also strengthening of ocean governance, and also combating waste and supporting marine biodiversity and reducing marine plastic pollution. And as part of that process, NUPI is associated to something called T20, which is kind of a group of think tanks working underneath G20. And as part of this T20 process, NUPI have prepared a paper on how to secure better ocean governance in an age of, or in a period of geopolitical tensions. So Elana Wilson-Rowe, our research professor, she will present that paper for you. Now, so that's the first part, gift to you. The second part, and that's great, we will have, as you know, oceans is a big topic these days. And actually we have managed to gather a great set of the key contributors to that debate. So we will have Alf Håkon Hoel, Professor Alf Håkon Hoel, who is, and in addition to co-writing this T20 paper, is also have provided a lot of the input into the high-level panel on ocean sustainability. And he will present some of the key message from the science community regarding oceans. And then we have also with us Special Advisor Sturla Henriksen, who's now heading the UN Global Compact on oceans. And they presented their paper last week, no, beginning of June. And this is also a very important paper feeding into the Ocean Conference and the high-level conference, I think, in the UN on oceans later this fall. Unfortunately, Unni had to, she's the leader of the ocean team in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She had to call in this morning and say that she's sick, so she was unable to be here to present her paper, or not her paper, but I think the government's ocean strategy. But to top this all off, we have been fortunate to be joined by Shirley Ong. She's a Canadian diplomat, and she's a senior policy advisor in the Canadian International Arctic Center. So thank you so much, and she will provide some comments towards the end. So that's the second gift. And the third reason why we meet today is that this basically also marks the beginning of our NUPI Center for Ocean Governance that we have established. And some of our staff, they are really good at acronyms, so they come up with the acronym COG. This gives the maritime flavor to it. And this center then will focus on ocean diplomacy in particular, geopolitics and security governance at sea, as well as the comparative and historical studies related to ocean governance. And this center is coordinated also by Elana Wilson-Rowe. So there are 3 things to celebrate today. But first we go straight to the content. We will have these presentations. They will have 7 or 8 minutes each. And then we have the comments by Shirley. And then we invite all of you to come up here to join in on a conversation. And then we have the Q&A. Let me also remind you that this seminar is streamed and also made available at our YouTube channel. Okay, then I give the floor to Elana, please.
Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here this morning to present to you our report from the think tank's 20 process that Ulf was speaking about. And this was a wonderful opportunity for NUPI to provide expert input to the world's wealthiest countries. The G20 is a varied context, but one thing that all of these countries have in common is that they are all coastal states, which tells you something about both the economic privilege and opportunities that comes from a geographical position on the sea. And as well, today what we're going to talk about are the increased responsibilities that come from that privileged coastal position. So in this report, we realized we were doing some science diplomacy. We reached out to authors in Australia and Japan. We would have liked to reach out to even more authors and gather more perspectives, except for the limitations of time that we all encounter in our own work. But basically, we wanted to bring together a broader team to think about what was possible and important in ocean governance, even in a world where we know that the broader order of governance is sometimes challenged. There are different views from important key states as to what this global order should look like. So basically, this discussion was very enriching, and we hope to continue to widen the network of experts. And I'm pleased to see the representatives of many of the G20 representations in Oslo here today, and hope that you can help us get in touch with researchers in your country as well. But I'd especially like to acknowledge my co-authors who are here today, Ulf and Alf Håkan, and we turn to the report. Which we tried to do here is basically present a zoomed-out view for an already packed G20 agenda. Now, given the knowledge in the room, I'll just go briefly through this kind of governance backdrop. I mean, basically, we've all heard in one form or another that the oceans are challenged. They're strongly affected by land-based activities, probably most prominently the global problem of climate change, the climate change emergency. So always what we'll come back to again and again, although we focus on other challenges and we come down to other more granular level issues, that the big backdrop is ensuring sufficient progress in mitigating climate change. And that really ties into the broader challenge for ocean stewardship about how to transform short-term economic interests into sustainable management-oriented processes and practices at both regional and global levels. So of course the challenge is, we've heard about, the bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef off the Australian coast as a demonstration of the problems of ocean acidification. We know that the changing water temperatures of the sea will affect distribution of fish stocks and the economies associated with them, and the melting ice sheets raising sea level and threatening small island states and coastal cities. Even despite regulatory progress, we also know that 1/3 of fish landings are still wasted before they reach the protein-hungry consumers that we hope to reach as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. At the same time, so we have this global concern for ocean health, both because of health issues for the ocean and global stewardship questions, and also because oceans are hoped to be a continued source of value creation and an increased source of value creation. I think we've all heard the number that the OECD estimates that the ocean's economic contribution will be doubled by 2030 compared to 2010. It's a big change. So then there are all these, what we know, we also have a very kind of comprehensive and well thought out system of ocean governance structures that handle many aspects of both legal questions and the growing blue economy. But the challenges remain: one, absence of full accession to international agreements that matter. Second, of course, improper, incomplete implementation of agreements, and this can be due to lack of capacity, which is an issue we'll come back to, or issues of political will tied with that. Finally, thirdly, what we need to be able to do is harness the capacity of all these interested actors, all these diverse networks, all of these diverse national interests, and letting these blossom in a number of kind of complicated and partially overlapping regimes, while ensuring that they add up on the whole, if not at the micro level, into a form of global order around oceans, and avoiding where we have so many regulations or options or sets of best practices that we come to a point where it's easy to choose one, maybe the easiest one, and go for kind of a form of blue washing. It looks good, but it doesn't achieve the right end, as opposed to more stringent approaches to managing the blue economy. And finally, the last challenge, I'll go into a slight bit more of detail, that what the oceans can do economically and how the oceans can be managed from a stewardship perspective is very much at the edge of this rapidly developing frontier of technology. So, and we can talk a bit more about this in Q&A if it's of interest to you. But basically, we have gaps that there's been lots of progress made on, from marine genetic resources to marine litter. But as technology continues to change, countries will be able to, governance gaps may emerge. For example, new technologies will enable countries to better monitor oceans and fishing. They can detect smuggling, drugs, weapons, as well as improve search and rescue at sea. So this includes drone technology, unmanned underwater vehicles, and advances in data technology and data visualization that will allow humanity to visualize and know about areas of the ocean that have been previously left mostly to fantasy. And this visibility of the ocean will bring great opportunities for those who are able to acquire and use such technology. At the same time, we know technology in general can create inequality. It can be expensive, it can privilege those who wield technology. So a challenge for that is how can this technology be used in ways that don't exacerbate already existing global inequalities, don't create vastly unequal playing fields for business, and avoiding bringing up new national security dilemmas. So our key recommendations for the G20, I'll turn to those now. We had kind of three broad ones and then several specific ones I'll take you through. So of course, first and foremost, the question of climate change and the need to exercise leadership in mitigating climate change. And this also includes how we use the ocean and how we do business there, including green shipping and really exploring and taking advantage of the role that oceans can play as carbon sinks, and thereby also having good spin-off effects for biodiversity and other issues. The second main goal is responsibility for implementing existing regulatory frameworks. And this includes both formal agreements under the UN, the Law of the Sea, including, for example, the Fish Stocks Agreement of 1994. I always get it wrong. And a wealth of best practices. As part of our reading for the report, we read a Nordic Council of Ministers report from 2017 on how to combat illegal and unregulated and unreported fishing. And there's a wealth of both regulatory and private sector schemes that, if implemented, could go a long way to closing the gap on fisheries crime and waste of fish hauls. But basically, the important part in doing this is about making a good case for the international order, really demonstrating how multilateral cooperation and adherence to regulation isn't just about a limitation on national authority or an undermining of national interests, but is exactly the vehicle through which those interests can be realized in a sustainable and long-term way. And finally is the question of course, implementation and capacity. That we will have problems of political will to do something. And then again, the question, demonstrating how cooperation can serve national interest is important. But then there is also a large issue of capacity. There's a wonderful graph that shows the per capita ocean researchers in each country. And you kind of see a steadily increasing line until you know this graph where you hit Norway, and they couldn't even show it on the graph. They had to kind of take out part. They had to jump from like 50 to 320 to show how many kind of ocean researchers Norway has. So that's a level of kind of expertise and long-term investment that has paid dividends for the Norwegian blue economy and the ocean health of Norway's ocean areas. So how do you achieve that in countries that are struggling, with poverty, with failed states, with broad governance challenges? How do you build capacity? How do you assist in building capacity to engage in ocean regulatory frameworks? Is a big question and an important source of financing. Now on to a few more specifics that kind of reflect back. Again, encourage a session. This is a question of compatibility. I think there are very few people who expect that we will see some sort of one global institution around environmental problems or around the oceans. So the question then is how to ensure a meaningful coordination and, in some, seen from outside, kind of a collective order around oceans, which makes room for both cohesiveness and compatibility while allowing, for example, for new regional structures or mechanisms or quick movement on the areas where progress can be made. And this ties into the importance of G20 states exercising leadership in global governance institutions. And here especially I'd like to highlight the importance of novel mechanisms, new forms of conversation. And I think that the high-level panel on ocean sustainability is a very interesting example of an effort in that direction. It will be very interesting to see how that develops, kind of a coalition of the willing in what are otherwise perhaps more turbulent political times. And finally, one of our more specific recommendations was the notion of establishing an expert cross-sector group to examine the opportunities and challenges linked to new technologies for collecting, processing, analyzing, and accessing data relating to the oceans. And this, what we envision there, is a group of an innovative conversation across those who have natural science, management knowledge of the oceans, technology governance experts, and also those from the private sector who are at the cutting edge of technological development. And this is a sort of innovative cross-sector conversation that will cut across environment, security, economy, and technology, and maybe make us more aware of the governance gaps that are on the horizon rather than the ones we have today. Finally, and as a segue into the next papers, is this question of how can markets and citizens, or private sector and citizens, do something for the oceans? What we see is that there's a wealth of best practice guidelines, and we think that the G20 should work with and support the UN Global Compact for the oceans in ensuring that investors and companies integrate ocean sustainability into their strategies, policies, and commitment. And this includes some of the G20's own guidelines for enterprises. And finally, we hope to see progress empowering kind of us as everyday citizens, concerned citizens, to make it possible to identify products and be kind of aware consumers of what products we use. Are they produced consistently with the principles of sustainable ocean governance? And then probably as a last exhortation to ourselves, and one of the reasons we established the Center for Ocean Governance is that we believe that we also need to continue to do excellent research. And Norway is absolutely a leader in oceans-related research. And what we hope to do at NUPI is contribute with a research at the intersection, at the confluence of different concerns. What we see is that often oceans are studied from a legal perspective, an environmental perspective, a security perspective, or an economic perspective. But our hunch is that probably a lot of what both is a challenge and where some of the fresh opportunities lie is looking across those four perspectives and engaging in interdisciplinary research that helps us identify how can further gains be made in ocean governance, even against these troubling political times where we know that global institutions are under pressure. So we look forward to continuing that conversation with all of you and today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elana. I should also say that Elana is also, of course, leading her ERC project on that is very much concerned about ocean governance as well and maritime governance. Alf Håkon, please.
Thank you. I have two or three slides that I want to share with you. The task I'm given to talk about is key messages from that is the wrong presentation. From the scientific community regarding the oceans. First slide, please. Yeah. The next. Okay. Taking the Sustainable Development Goals as our point of departure, the two big questions facing us when it comes to achieving sustainable management of the oceans are basically how can we increase production and how can we ensure that marine ecosystems are protected. the Norwegian Prime Minister last year established a high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy. And as a part of the work in that panel, the Institute of Marine Research convened a conference with 150 of the world's leading marine scientists in November last year to address these two questions. And these 150 scientists came from about 150 countries and produced a report, this one, with about 40 recommendations for action in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in 5 areas. And one area was the mitigation of climate change. Another area was ocean health, specifically doing something about different kinds of pollution. A third area of recommendations related to sustainable fisheries, how to achieve that, doing away with overfishing. Still another area was aquaculture and the continued development of aquaculture. Very important to ensure continued food production from the oceans. And finally, there was also a question of the contribution of seafood to nutrition, which is much more important than at least I believed before that conference. So the conference came up with these 40 plus recommendations, passed on to the high-level panel. And the high-level panel, as you may know, have an expert group represented here today with Jan Gunnar Winther. And that expert group is now in the process of producing a number of blue papers containing even more specific recommendations in a number of issue areas. All of these 5 areas I mentioned are politically important, and they are scientifically important, and in order to do something about them, good scientific advice is absolutely critical. While we in Norway are lucky to have a well-developed marine science community, that is not the case all over the world. The Global Ocean Science Report from 2017 demonstrated that this capacity to actually do marine science is rather limited to, and that large part of the world do not have this capacity to do marine science for advice to governments for their marine policies. So in order to address the global marine silences, it's very important that capacity development for marine science is prioritized and given sufficient resources to provide the knowledge needed for management. A lot can be said in this regard. In Norway, we have the Fish for Development program. In NORAD, it's fundamentally the Nansen project, which is a research vessel doing surveys of developing countries, and then a number of smaller projects. Altogether, about 200 million Norwegian kroner, which is a tiny, tiny part of the total official development budget, which is in the ballpark range of 30 billion Norwegian. kroner. So one important question for this seminar is perhaps to talk about how can we promote development in scientific capacity in developing countries. How can Norway contribute to that? We have a number of experiences in this regard and have been active in the field for several decades. And this is an area where it is really possible to do something and achieve something. Another second point I wanted to make is that we are about to embark on the UN decade for marine science. In 2017, the UN General Assembly proclaimed the UN decade of marine science for sustainable development. And the planning for that decade is ongoing now. The decade will start in 2021. A major global conference for planning was held a few weeks ago in Copenhagen. And only last week we had a meeting in New York in the UN. And there is a lot of political interest and energy out there for driving this decade, and it's a once in a lifetime opportunity really to do something about lifting the global enterprise of marine science. And the ultimate objective is really to create the science we need for the ocean we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alf Håkon. Excellent. And then we give the floor to Sturla Henriksen, who also a lot of you know as a keen diver and also the former leader of the Ship Owners Association. So, but now acting in the capacity as the leader of the special advisor or coordinator of the UN, special advisor to Ocean UN Global Compact.
That's true. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ulf and Elana, and congrats with the new center, and thanks for the invitation here. Very good morning to all of you. May I ask you a question? How many of you are business executives with a mandate to make investment decisions? One? Yeah. More? Two? Come to hear me? Yeah, okay, okay. One or two. That's actually not bad. You know? I was at the Blue Economy Conference in Nairobi before Christmas, like 4,000 plus participants. I asked this question to an audience of about 1,000 people, a handful. We've gone systematically through the participant lists of the Arctic Circle, Arctic Frontier, our Ocean Conference, more or less the same. That means that we are not engaging the business community in a systematic manner. We're not engaging the people who are to make investment decisions, who are to make the innovations needed, who have vast amounts of experience and insights needed for this purpose. Remember, in the ocean, all the big investments made in vessels, in fish farming, offshore energy production, these are investments which have a lifespan of 25 to 40 years or beyond. So, existing most of the assets in the ocean, they are fixed. But we can do something about that to ensure sustainability. We can do operational changes, we can do retrofitting our equipment, but we need to engage this part of the community. We know that there is now a large activity in cross-sector development, like offshore companies engaging in offshore floating wind farms, using the competencies, their capacities to develop floating windmills, floating wind farms. They're now designing and developing ocean fish farms, the size of the bird's nest Olympic Stadium in Beijing, to be deployed in areas beyond national jurisdiction. How do we engage these? We know that next year, Yara Birkeland, the world's first fully autonomous and fully electric vessel, will be put in operation outside of Norway. But how? I mean, it's only because we have a very forward-leaning Norwegian Maritime Authority that have designed a test field in the Trondheim Fjord and have been very innovative in their regulatory, in their interpretation of the regulatory mandate, that this is now coming through. So this is very much at the backdrop of why at the UN Global Compact we decided to create an ocean action platform. What we did here, and for those of you who are not that familiar with the UN Global Compact, it's the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, has like 14,000 signatories. It's UN's main body for cooperation with the international business community. The board is chaired by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres. So what we did here was to say, we need to engage business. Now this is way too important to invite everybody to participate, because that is a traditional model of the UN Global Compact. If you want to, they have 9 action platforms on health, on finance, on different climate, and everybody who wants to participate can do so. Here we said, no, we can't invite all. Then it will become a conference like many other conferences. So what we did was that selectively we invited 35 companies, oceans related, which means that both those who have water around their operations, but also suppliers, like the financial community, institutional investors, insurance, equipment producers, DNVGL, classification societies, cargo owners. And then we said, now, this is a proposition. I like to call this a fitness center concept. You pay a lot of money, and you have to do all the workout yourself. And that's the deal. So these companies, they're paying to be part of the project, not for us at the UN to do the job. But with that payment follows a commitment, an obligation to participate with your top management, with your capacity and your competence. They have to do the job themselves. And what we did was that, and in addition to that, of course, we have a handful of prominent scientific communities part of this. We want to be fact-based. And Jan Gunnar is heading the Center for the Ocean and the Arctic, and they're part of this group. We also have a handful of the most important UN agencies here. And we have the World Bank and the WWF, just to draw your attention to some of these. Now, the scope of this project is not only SDG 14, which is life below water. What we did was that we took the broad scope. How can the ocean industries contribute to all of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals? How can we ensure that the business community is contributing to the twin challenge that we're facing, both protecting the ocean and producing more from the ocean? Because we need to tap the ocean's resources to produce more food, more energy, more transportation, more metals and minerals, possibly, more medicines. And all of these are interlinked with the big challenges that we are facing in achieving all of these goals in a world where we are becoming increasingly more people. So what we did was that we defined 3 main action tracks for this, because at this level we wanted to find what is the right altitude for this project. And we asked ourselves, we had a sort of a strategy session where we asked ourselves, if we were a newly established company, what would be our competitive advantage? With the resources, with the knowledge, with the network that we are possessing, what should be our main goals? And we decided on 3 areas. One is ocean opportunities, the narrative of the ocean. What are the challenges that we're facing in protecting an ocean where the ocean health is deteriorating rapidly? And what are the business opportunities arising from these SDGs? And this report was launched on the week before last. And I have a copy here, but I will provide you with the, if you go to UN Global Compact on the net, you will find it there. So that's a narrative. That's a narrative. And it's with contributions from more than 300 actors from all around the world. Bottom up, what do we see from our vantage point? And then also the World Bank and OECD has sort of contributed the macro perspective. So this is the first of its kind. Secondly, if we are to achieve these opportunities, reap the benefits on the oceans, we need governance. We need regulations. So we asked ourselves, what is the current state of regulations? And that proved to be a more demanding task than we had thought. So with very good assistance from a lot of people and from DNVGL and Alpha Conho, we mapped the current situation. And this proved to be the first of its kind. And what we found was that there's several interesting findings, but one was that there are actually 26 different UN bodies with some kind of regulatory competence in the ocean. Many of them don't speak together. Some of them don't even know of each other. So this was the first step. So this is now subject to consultation. And the next report will now identify gaps, inconsistencies, and overlaps. So that will be the next part of this. But we do know that the regulatory developments, they are often slow processes, typically at the IMO, which I know quite well. It will take like 10 to 15 years from an initiative is tabled before it's ratified and coming into effect. We can't wait for that. So we have asked our companies to come forward, step up, and act as stewards for sustainable ocean developments. And this piece of paper, 9 principles, what we did was that we took the 10 general principles of sustainability of UN Global Compact and asked ourselves, if these were sort of translated into ocean sustainability, what would that look like? And these 9 principles are what we arrived at. And all the participating companies have now signed these principles. They will be launched during the General Assembly week in the UN. And these are principles which are above and beyond, of course, a regulatory framework. And some of them are fairly ambitious. But they already are taking effect. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which has been heading this work, they have already ejected a number of shipping companies practicing beaching in Southeast Asia. There's no international regulation in force which prevents shipping companies from doing that. But as we know, there is no right way to do wrong things. And if it's wrong, you should stop doing it. And in that sense, this is sort of a codification of decent behavior and common sense. But still, it makes a difference. It makes a commercial difference. Also, some of the world's largest insurance companies have now ejected fisheries companies, which are part of this, which they have ejected fisheries companies, which are not reporting accurately on their catches. They are terminating the insurance. The big banks are now DNB, ABN AMRO. They are now amending their lending agreements to reflect these principles. Total, a member of our group, will now make it mandatory for those who wish to be business partners or wish to be part of their procurement lists, their biddings, that they sign these principles. So what we're doing here is that we are using the market forces, using the commercial mechanisms to discipline and drive the business community in a sustainable direction. And these are the main action tracks. In addition to this, we have an action track on plastics in the ocean. Total and Covestro, both members of our group, they have, together with a handful of other companies, they have now pledged $1.5 billion to look at how can we reduce, reuse, and retrieve plastics from the oceans. We have an action track just now launched on the Arctic, a new ocean opening up with in a very particular sensitive and challenging area. And we have also launched an action track on ocean innovations. We call it Ocean Accelerators. It's headed by MIT and has now companies all over the world, 7 I believe now. And we will also host hackathons where we are engaging young, innovative people and research communities in finding solutions to present problems. So our ambition is like, much like Alf Håkon said, is to make this the project that we need for the ocean that we want. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring, and congratulations with a lot of interesting and good work. Now I give the floor to Shirley. Maybe some of you heard her coughing a bit. So thank you so much, because she's not feeling too well today, but thank you so much for joining on, Shirley. Please, floor is yours.
Well, thanks for inviting me to this session. You know, I guess I start off, and I'm not sure this is boding well for my comments, that I'm no expert on oceans governance whatsoever. More recently, I've been doing a little bit more work focused on the Arctic and Canada's engagement in this area. The way I thought I would structure my comments today is just to give a few observations on what has been discussed today. And then a few of my own observations with respect to the files that I currently cover in terms of its potential applicability in the Arctic, at least in Canada's north, and what we're doing. Thank you, NUPI, for putting that paper together, because it was a very good way to summarize at the beginning those three concepts, right? Engagement of the private and the public sector. Secondly, the capacity building. Whether or not we're looking at G20 or non-G20 countries, capacity building period, I think, is important. And then the other element where you had flagged global and regional leadership, because oceans is global, but the issues can be regional because of the things that we're looking at and the different types of instruments and mechanisms that are in place that govern what is happening in that area. Where I think that there's one common theme throughout, and I think everyone agree with regards to oceans, is the need for a comprehensive and a robust approach. I don't mean to be cliched about that, but I think, you know, hearing from the science community, hearing from the business community gives very clear direction in terms of what types of actions and what type of contributions can be made in terms of looking at future policy making And I think one of the broader concepts or what issues is really inclusive and sustainable. So often we're dictated by our political cycles that run at a 4 to 5 year cycle, and when we're looking at a global issue, that changes as well, because every single country, every single area has different governance structures in place. We're not even talking about oceans governance, we're just talking about general governance structures. My other comment that I would say is this thing when we talk about cohesive policies. I think what's important is to, of course, make use of the existing legal structures and mechanisms that we have, like UNCLOS, like IMO, Polar Code in the case of the Arctic, and as Sturla had mentioned, but those do move at a particular place. But that doesn't preclude then scientific actors, community actors, business actors to also take an active role in initiating particular actions or policies or mechanisms where they can make a direct change on how their businesses or their work affects what happens in the oceans. The part maybe I'd like to discuss a little bit more is this notion of what Alana had mentioned, empowering citizens. And I'm going to take the word citizen a little bit more broadly, empowering the communities. We talk about national, we talk about regional. There's different levels of authority, if you will, and I think that empowering of citizens is quite important. And maybe I focus on this a little bit more, because when we look at Canada's Arctic and the North, we have quite a complex governing structure, given the nature of our country. And what's very important within that structure is the local coastal communities, the Indigenous communities. There are very clear legal instruments that are in place that provide for this interaction, and that's a very important part of how our North will develop. And these are the people that are living in the North. What struck me, in particularly moving to Norway, is your country is primarily north of 60, but the Gulf Stream really makes for a very different situation. And so when we're looking at how we manage what's happening with our water, and at the end of the day, these are still the homes that people live in. But interestingly, what's changing that dynamic is international interest. Business does not adhere to those traditional borders, right? But, I think there is, I would assume, amongst people here, and there should be some type of agreed upon common vision, common set of principles about how we move forward and what we want to achieve and what we would desire to accomplish. And so while you'll have different countries and you have different things, but you do have these international interests that then converge onto areas that maybe in the past did not elicit so much interest before. And here maybe I'll take a couple small examples within Canada in terms of how we're looking at conservation, oceans governance, and how we work with our local communities. One thing that we have are what we call the marine protected areas. And so there are 2 marine protected areas in our Arctic, which are done in conjunction with the local authorities. We have these land claim agreements, which are essentially type modern treaties, so we're working with the local Indigenous communities. And you set very clear goals, and as part of that, you also have to provide the capacity. So this is an important aspect of kind of, if you will, kind of an integration across different levels of communities, stakeholders, and government, stakeholders for lack of a better term. The other thing, I think that we want to think about is when we talk about climate change and mitigation and what we want for the future. I know our department, not my department, the Government of Canada, on the Transport Canada side, they're looking at things called low-impact shipping corridors. How do we want our waterways used? What is the historical use of it? How should that be managed? How do we do it? Because also in terms of conservation, because marine biodiversity, those are all very important elements to what we want our home or what our waters to look like in the future. And I think this can be applied across all different levels. A good example is the AECO, the Arctic Expedition Cruise Operators, that are obviously active across the circumpolar community, and how they interact with the local communities addressing issues like gray water, because that does impact where they go through. And again, these are not large communities. They're communities potentially of a couple hundred people. So that's my general observation is the need for a comprehensive and a robust approach, and that you can really incorporate kind of the needs at the same time also fulfill the objectives of the different stakeholder groups. It's definitely not easy, but I think going forward, one of the larger challenges that I'm kind of curious, and maybe this is for discussion later, is what's the compatibility between all these initiatives? Because sometimes I feel like it's a bit like you have a glass of water, is it half empty or half full? And I take the example of sometimes I think about the the agreement on the Central Arctic Ocean, where they've agreed to, based on science, we're going to decide 16 years from now what's going to happen with respect to fishing. So when you speak to some, you get the impression that, okay, in 16 years, we'll figure out the science on how to fish. For others, it's like 16 years, we've got to figure out, we'll wait to see if we're going to fish. So you're looking at the same issue, but again, it's a bit of a half empty or half full perspective. And I think the larger question at the end of the day is, how do you find this integration and compatibility between initiatives, between structures? Sarah's comment that I didn't realize there was 26 UN bodies that were related to ocean governance and didn't talk to each other. But on top of that, you have all the other types of regional bodies that are in place. So I'm going to leave it there, because more questions, kind of more observations, and hope that we have the opportunity to further explore those items. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Could I invite all of the speakers up, sit here, and then we open up a discussion. Thank you so much for excellent presentations. We have heard basically, I heard a different. I'm not attending to summarize, but Alf Håkon has been kind of making a strong plea for science, and then Sturla has provided a lot of arguments why business have to engage and should engage and are engaging. And then Elana also talked, and Shirley talked about also the government's responsibility to try to regulate somehow. And let me just start by picking up on what Shirley said, because as I understand you said, okay, how are these things kind of coming together? But Alf Håkon and Sturla, you didn't say anything about basically about the role of government and regulations. So what are the limitations to what business can do, Sturla, and to Alf Håkon? What are the somehow limits to a science-driven ocean governance?
Well, fundamentally, there is a wealth of international agreements out there pertaining to all of these 5 problem areas I mentioned, climate change, resource management, and so on and so forth. And the fundamental issue is really implementing those agreements, as we said in the T20 paper. If countries were actually doing something effectively about the obligations they have undertaken in the Law of the Sea Convention or in climate agreements or whatever, the status of the marine environment would be significantly better than it is today. And the argument I'm trying to make is that improving the quality of science and the capacity to do marine science in developing countries in particular would be a very helpful step in the right direction. And I think that Norway could do a lot more in that respect.
Yeah, you asked about the limitations of what the business community can do. Well, obviously, the limitations are those created by the market forces. In the long run, I think that most realize that if you are to develop a sustainable business, you have to be part of and contribute to a sustainable society. But long run, as we know, consists of many short. So you have to survive in the short runs. And here I think that what I see is that there is a very strong driving force now, a much stronger force than only a few years ago when it comes to sustainability. I think there are very, very few large companies now which do not have explicit or implicit references to one or more of the Sustainable Development Goals in their business strategies. And that is a very good thing. I think that we have moved from a sort of rejection of the responsibility of business towards the social component of this, to an embracement in the sense that they see that this is good for business. It's good for how they are attracting stakeholders, be it shareholders, employees, business partners, customers. It has to be a part of their business contribution. Now, when they are establishing these goals and principles, they have to make sort of a decision on where do we put the bar. And it would not be very difficult for us to put the bar even higher than we did here if we wanted to target the top 5 or top 10%. But we thought that it was much more important to make changes which were within reach of the lion's share of the business community. So we said that, okay, let's try to codify this in a way which means that 80% of current business can apply these. And this is what we've done. And what we think is that this will become very rapidly the business standard across the board. And when this becomes business standard, then regulations will follow, because it will be much easier for governments to apply the same standards in the regulatory processes, and it will be much more difficult for governments not to follow the same standards in their regulatory ambitions.
I think I'd like to pick up on the point about science, because one thing we know from studies of science and technology and the reception of scientific knowledge, we know that it's not enough to have scientific consensus globally. It's not enough to just know that this is a best practice or this is a major concern, that a huge part of how science comes to matter in national political processes is about local interlocutors. It's about local actors or national actors from that country who are willing to speak on behalf of that science, who are willing to kind of attest to its validity and importance. And so that sort of, so I would just like to underline that even, as Alf Håkon was saying, that we know a lot what we need to know, but in terms of how to communicate it out to countries that are developing, countries that face many other pressing challenges, is absolutely about building up the scientific actors in those communities and in those countries who can speak on behalf of global science and make contributions back to global science, perhaps particularly about new, specific regional specifics or about stakeholder dialogue. And I also wanted to pick up on something from Shirley's presentation, if I may, that we frequently talk about how stakeholder dialogue matters. But I think we really are still waiting to see what does an inclusive stakeholder dialogue on the oceans look like? As a kind of an Arctic researcher, somewhat new to this global ocean perspective, I'm always constantly being surprised and shocked by things like your fish farm the size of a stadium or something. So who is the stakeholder for that? Who are, and I think in Norway we had the, recent example of, the question of how much more offshore oil and gas development or on the coast of, or around Lofoten was this question, well, who was the stakeholder in deciding that this is best for us? Is it local? Is it national? And how does a dialogue around that take place? So I think that will be, if we think of climate, how both our focus on mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change has produced some incredibly progressive politics, but has also been part of producing some of the backlash against regulation and the growth of kind of more populist stances and choices made at the national level in elections. How does oceans kind of go for that same kind of real change, yet at the same time produce a sense that this is about all of us, this is about important changes that we can all be a part of and contribute to, I think will be a really key challenge.
Okay, Sturla, brief remark on this, and then we open the floor for comments and questions.
Just briefly tagging on to what to Ilana on this example with the ocean fish farm. These are huge structures. Today, it's not clear which is the international regulatory body for this. When you're in areas beyond national jurisdiction, is it IMO? When you talk to Kitaklim, it says, no, it's not us. FAO, maybe, parts of it, but not all. ISA? No, not necessarily. What about UNESCO, IOC? Are they part of this? Probably, but not certainly. So this is just one out of, I can mention several examples, where this is sort of a confusion now, where the technological and commercial developments are ahead of regulatory developments. There are gaps and there are parts that we need to solve, because these industrial activities, we probably need them to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
And now we have some few questions. The first, yeah. No,
Okay.
I have you on the list, but you have to pass the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Jan Gunnar Winter. I'm heading the Center for the Ocean and the Arctic. First, congratulations to NUPI and Elana for this excellent report to the G20 meeting, and of course also you, Ulf. I have two questions, one for each of my good colleagues, Alf Håkon and Sturla. Alf Håkon first. Norway thinks that we have an excellent tool in the integrated management plan. So I wonder if you have any thoughts when we are using that tool outside Norway, if there are some fundamental things that are similar in different parts of the world that doesn't have such a tool that we can apply, and how much tailor-made solutions do we need to make for each region or countries. Maybe also how can we learn from other countries. To Sturla, I'm impressed. I'm really impressed how you push the business sector in the right direction. I'm working in the Arctic, and I'm working especially in the Norwegian Arctic. Can I copy and paste? Or is small businesses different? Is there any tricks that I should use to make this model, this network thinking, applicable for the Norwegian Arctic? Coastal communities, small businesses.
You want to respond right now on these two comments on the Norwegian integrated model somehow?
Yeah, okay. The basis for your question is really that the pressures on the oceans and the uses of the oceans are growing all the time. So the sort of the total load of impacts on the oceans are growing, and that brings forward the need to view different activities and different pictures. You have to view them comprehensively. And this is well recognized all over the world, I think, and in Norway we've done something about this by way of the integrated ocean management plans. And I think the way we've gone about it in Norway is a very useful one also elsewhere in the world, because it's very pragmatic. It's not a huge bureaucracy created around it, and it's conducive to taking really the overall view of our uses of the oceans. But it has really no major regulatory effect. It's a plan for the different ocean areas, and I think that way of going about it is useful and something that could be implemented elsewhere in the world. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you, Gunnar. I think you can apply just the same concept. You can use that as a blueprint. I think that whether they are big or smaller companies, I think the key here is that you make sure that they are committed, so that you have a selection process, that those you admit on board in the project, they are really committed to delivering, and that you are scoping the projects and the goals. And then also we are now in the UN project, we are now on the action track on the Arctic. We are now focusing on two areas. One is search and rescue, capacity there. And secondly is to develop, based on these 9 principles, guidances. What does this mean for Arctic investments and operations? And they will build on existing governance structures, existing regulations, and also existing guidances like the Arctic Investment Protocol that you and I were both part of the World Economic Forum panel, which developed that.
Okay. Now we have a question over here. And then...
My name is Endre Stiansen. I represent UNDP, which is one of the 26 UN agencies working on oceans. It's not well known that we have actually a very large oceans portfolio, including an oceans program. Our portfolio is $200 million, so it's quite substantial. And of course, we work in 170 countries across the world. Now, I must admit, when I've received the invitation to this event, I had to read it twice, because I couldn't believe that this was the first Norwegian Center on Ocean Governance. Being, a seafaring nation, being, having so much investment in this, all of this history. So this is extremely welcome initiative, and I wish you good luck. A few comments, and then not so much a gift, but an invitation. The comments first relates to the SDGs. It was so striking when you were talking. Some of you referred to the SDGs specifically, but not so much in the opening statement. But of course, all you're talking about is the implementation of the SDGs. 13 on climate, 14 on oceans, 16 on governance, 17 on partnership. And you really have an agenda there that is, of course, extremely forward-looking, very, very solid, and you're fitting right in. So this is just taking it to the next level. 16 is where UNDP, that's our bread and butter. Institutions. I noticed in your introduction, Ulf, where you talked about that the emphasis would be on ocean diplomacy and so on. Of course, that's very welcome. It's very much needed. But there is a small g to governance, and that's the institutional part. You won't be able to get where you want to go if you don't get the institutions to work properly across the world. You mentioned, Sturla fitness model. Well, we're using not so much fitness, but fit for purpose. The institutions across the globe, in every single country, especially in developing countries, has to become fit for purpose if they're going to develop, if we're going to do better on these, especially on climate goals and so on. So whilst the private sector is excellent, these initiatives are good, and we're happy to be part of the Global Compact, we have to look at the governance institutions locally, and we got to lift them up, just as we have to lift up the institutions locally that are doing the scientific research. Now, with that, as that was our invitation. Our invitation. So the invitation from me, maybe even a gift. Let's collaborate on that. We have the setup. We know about institutions. We are ready to work on taking this, forward with you to make sure that the institutional setup, the 26 UN organizations with everybody else are fit for purpose to meet these challenges.
Excellent, thank you so much. And I suggested we collect a bit, and then there's over there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for very interesting discussions, and I especially appreciate you reaching out to G20 countries. I think.
To kind of introduce yourself, please.
Yes. I'm Kazumi Yamada, counselor and deputy head of mission from the Embassy of Japan in Oslo. We appreciate your reaching out to G20 countries. This is very timely in the framework of G20, as we are having the summit meeting of the G20 countries on the 28th and 29th of this month. And just last weekend, on the 15th and the 16th, we had the meeting of environmental and economic ministers who have put together a series of papers which will be submitted to the summit at the end of this month. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce a little bit of what Japan, as the presidency or the chairman of the G20 countries, have in mind in hosting the summit meeting. And also, in process of that, I'd like to touch upon some of the points that was discussed this morning, and then also to pose a question or a comment from the government point of view at the end. At the outset, I must also say that I am not an expert on environmental issues. I have a little bit of background on the oceans. I worked on a lot of the sea convention before I came to Norway, but I am not really an expert. So I will try to stick to the positions of government as well as the G20. But some of my comments will reflect on my personal comments from my past experiences.
Can you please be a bit brief when you do this?
Yes. Yeah, sure. I just wanted to introduce to you some of the views that the G20 has. I think the intergovernmental efforts, especially on the plastic trash issues, was taken up more broadly in the G7 framework, but we realized that many, as the statistics that's often referred to, shows that the G7 produces only 2% of the microplastic in the ocean, so we have to be more encompassing in bringing in more countries and developing countries on board. So that's one of the aims, and I think the significance of taking this up in the G20 framework. And I also put emphasis on that in the past, I think the efforts to on the environmental issues was seen as an economic burden, but I think that's very much changed today. I think we don't have to see it as an economic burden, but it's an economic opportunity rather. And so that's the second point. That
I'm a bit sorry, because this is it's a bit of a Q&A session. So we have a long list of people who want to join in the conversation.
Yes.
So if you can kind of jump to your question, that would be great. Thank you.
Okay. And on the point about having cooperation between the government and also incorporating the private sector, the G20 meeting of economic and environmental ministers have came up with a framework which invite the private sector, civil society organizations, NGOs, and academia to work in a multi-sector manner and invite them to take actions in line with this framework. So I think that's a step forward in incorporating from the government side, the private sector and the research sector. And my question is that there are also, I think the members of government always struggle to coordinate different initiatives at the government's level. For example, Norway has taken a lot of initiative in this area. They're not a part of G20, but they have the ocean panel on sustainable economic development. And also you're hosting the Our Ocean this year in the fall. And if I'm wondering if you have any suggestions as to how to coordinate and work better among these different initiatives, not only between the UN organizations. I think we have a lot to work on, even between the UN organizations, but there are also other initiatives, and if you have any suggestions on how to make these coordination and make these bodies more effective.
Okay, thank you so much. Do you want to respond slightly to what Endre brought up on cooperation, governance, and also I would say development, transferring, on building capacity in the south, for instance, and also this idea about intergovernmental cooperation?
Regarding coordination, cooperation at the global level, then you often hear the argument that there are too many bodies out there and too many instruments, and that we do need a global ocean treaty to put it all together into one box and get the real coordination and overview. And I think that is gravely mistaken. I do think that there is a lot of coordination and cooperation going on, but it's maybe not that visible. But for example, in the UN system, you have a body called the UN Oceans consisting of 28 agencies meeting frequently, doing the inter-UN coordination. So I think the coordination problem is somewhat exaggerated, really, and the global system is not that complex when it comes to oceans management. Really, if you look at the organization map of the municipality of Oslo, that is more complicated than the global ocean management system.
This is more about Oslo, maybe.
That it should be possible. Elana.
I also wanted to follow on with that. I think that there is a point about the idea of all of this should add up to some form of order, right? There shouldn't be competing. It shouldn't, in the end, what we hope is a presentation of a clear set of direction to go. And I was thinking, I'm seeing Lars Otto from former AMAP secretary, and thinking about Arctic governance. And I think, you know, and often the same criticism is, is there too much overlap? Are we pulling in too many directions? Is the network too loose and open? And I think that actually having multiple layers, having networks that move more quickly because perhaps it's a low-hanging fruit or the motivation is high, having networks that stay and kind of trudge along with the most difficult problems that maybe won't result in any real action for 10 or 15 years, but holding a focus, really has something to say for it. So I think the challenge with ocean governance is really to take the best out of complexity, keep it open, keep it innovative, regulate where it's possible, implement the regulation that has already been achieved. But at the same time, we'll have to just live with the fact that there are multiple networks, overlaps, that maybe there is some repetition, but that in the end, what we can hope is a more open network structure will result in innovation and will result in kind of coalitions of the willing going as quickly as they can, and perhaps setting the standard for those who come after. And I just want to say I appreciated your comment on institutions and governance, because of course this question of good governance and how do you build capacity to govern in countries that may be struggling with many pressing issues, I think has been basically the question, for the past decades. And I think that oceans are one powerful way that raised this. For example, even just the movement of plastic waste raises the question of that governance in places far away affects all of us. It matters for all of us. So I hope that also oceans and these questions that come with it maybe result in an increased optimism, or at least a maintained commitment to these challenging questions that don't often have immediate reward but merit focus probably more than any other issue area that we have.
Now I have 4 or 5 people on the list, and we have 12 minutes left. So I suggest that if you can be pointed, and then we take some questions, and then you will have a possibility to respond towards the end. So we take all of them in the floor. So first, Ole Jakob there.
Hello, Ole Jakob Sending here at NUPI. You've talked a lot about the governance of the oceans, but I was wondering if I could challenge you to also say a little bit about the politics of oceans. So it's much more than a coordination problem, as I know that you know. So I would like to hear your reflections on the main lines of divisions and conflict with regards to ocean government.
And then gentleman in the back there.
My name is Pierre Christian Ensjø, Spitzberg Holding. As all environmental questions, I would say practically everything, it starts with thinking the whole cycle from extraction through production to use and after use. Today, a lot of people are concerned about plastic, and the alarm has been sounded since China banned import of waste plastic. With all these international assemblies coming up in the near future, it would be very interesting if there was some encouragement for technological and commercial development of business-oriented ways of utilizing residual plastic. That would save us quite a bit of concern.
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I'm an old age pensioner and independent analyst. We have just heard that there are 26 different UN subsidiaries dealing with ocean governance, and they don't talk to each other. Is that really so? My experience is mainly with the RFMOs, and I suppose that the 26 includes the RFMOs, and they have an excellent record. They've been hugely successful, not only in managing the issues within their own remits, but also in coordination between themselves. So I just wonder, what is the problem in general with these bodies not talking to each other? What are the other ones in particular which constitutes a problem? Thank you.
Here.
I'm Yves de Koning. I come from the Norwegian Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries, and I also head a working group for Interpol on fisheries crime. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to be here and congratulate you on this center that you have initiated. Ocean governance is certainly something that's very important to us. And I would like to pick up on the point on implementation that Professor Hoel raised. Now, from our point of view, we've been working literally on the underbelly of ocean governance. We're looking at the criminals, the spoilers of the system. And when I heard Mr. Henriksen's talk here now about the role of business in bringing business forward and to reach new goals, I often wonder, I mean, that's a very sort of Foucaultian governmentality approach to it. You know, you set the conditions for better standards to be brought to light and to be reached. But how do business address the underbelly, those that will then take the gap, as it were, those that will exploit those resources that others leave behind? Thank you.
And then can I just add in and build upon what Ole Jakob Sending brought up, because we have discussed about science, lack of coordination, local content, local capacity, etc. But Ole Jakob brought up this issue of politics and cleavages. But there's also another very important aspect going on, and that relates to security and let's say militarization. So as we speak, somehow the South China Sea is a very disputed military area. We have conflicts in the Gulf region, and we see quite significant technological developments in the field of submarines, unmanned vessels, etc., drones in the sea, and also rather revolutionary development in satellite drones that have huge security implications as well. So I would like you also to bring that up in addition to some of the excellent questions that came up. So now I give all of you, let's say, 2 minutes, and you can pick and choose.
Yeah, to the last first. I think that there is a recognition that we are sort of, in many ways, in the century of the ocean, but we are also in the century of Asia. I mean, half population and so on. And I firmly believe that the oceans will become even more important. More than 80% of trade is carried by vessels. Keeping the trade lanes open will be extremely important, as we can now see also in the Strait of Hormuz. The race for resources. Elliot Cohen of Johns Hopkins University says that it's possible that the race for the resources on the seabed can resemble the race for the European colonial powers' race for resources in Africa 200 years ago. Geostrategically, if you now that we are having a rising power, China challenging the incumbent, we know that control, dominance of the ocean is key to that. So this is all related to geopolitics. Very briefly, residual plastic, there was a question. Yes, we have reached out to L'Oreal, Adidas and Inditex. They are all using now recyclable plastic from the ocean, so that's a commercial driven process. The 26 UN bodies, I didn't say that any of them doesn't talk together. I said that a number of them don't talk together, and some of them don't know of the other. But there's an excellent cooperation between the main UN bodies in this. Your question to the IUU, illegal fishing. What we are doing in our project is to develop ways and means to ensure traceability of catches. And with that follows also the possibility to introduce sanctions, be it that they are ejected from ports, they're not allowed to land the catches, to terminating insurances, losing investors and loans.
Can you give the floor to Shirley and then to Odd Håkon, and then Elana, since you're the coordinator of the center as well, you might have the final word, okay? So Shirley, please.
Address the politics of oceans. I think, as Sterling mentioned, the geopolitics aspect of it is one thing that's going to change, I think, a lot of the dynamics. How geopolitics is changing the emergence of China, regardless of how one feels about what you've got a shift right now in geopolitics, right? Alliances in terms of looking at the relationship between China and Russia, for example. How does that affect how Europe looks at it? How does that affect how Northeast Asia looks at it? I think one of the more curious things going forward is who's considered a valid stakeholder in these discussions. We talk a lot about institutions, we talk a lot about these legal mechanisms, we talk a lot about these different measures, but who has a right at that table? I think that's the biggest question mark and one of the biggest challenges going forward. And when we look at oceans, that gets even more complicated. We have the EEZs, you have the high seas, but is it borders? Is it economic interests? Is it community interests? How will those be defined in terms of saying who has a valid place at the negotiating table at the end of the day?
To Jakob's question about the politics, painting with a really broad brush, I would say there are two conflict dimensions. One relating to the continuum between protection and utilization, and the other being north and south. You could really, if you want to paint a big global picture of ocean politics, you could use that as your organizing device. Regarding coordination at the global level, we do have a body inside the UN system for that, the UN Oceans. The main limitation on that is the restrictions posed on that body by the UN member states. And in addition, there is an annual resolution negotiated under the UN General Assembly, which is really the global ocean coordination with all member countries in the UN having the opportunity to participate. And the annual resolution is a big document, about 50 pages and 30,000 words, laying out the global ocean coordination every year. Thank you.
Just wanted, as a wrap-up comment, that I think, for example, the Arctic provides us with an illustration of a place where there are many competing political concerns and interests. It's somehow the regional zoom in on the littoral or the Arctic, coastal and other Arctic states has created this kind of political frame that has allowed for progress and cooperation despite quite diverging global agendas in other issue areas. So I think in terms of, I agree with your delineation of kind of the key political fault lines, but I think it'll be interesting to see to what extent regional cooperation around ocean areas might find a way of identifying what some of those more immediate national interests are and highlighting the fact that those national interests really can't be achieved separate from cooperation with the adjacent states. It's a little more difficult to imagine in the South China Sea, but I think that's something to, it's a framework to think with. And I would also like to flag that we hope to continue this seminar series, and actually one of the next topics we're thinking of is China and global ocean governance, and then followed by private actors in maritime security. So it's just the start of a longer conversation here at NUPI.
Thank you so much. So let me again thank all the speakers for excellent start of the day. Very refreshing, pointing, clear, but also fairly consistent, I would say, remarks as well from different angles, reaching towards the same goal. In particular, thanks also to Shirley for your comments and remarks. It's always nice and refreshing to have a perspective slightly from the outside, pointing us in the direction. And then thanks to all of you for coming here this morning. for your encouragement and support for our center, and then we will look at follow the news coming out of the Japanese presidency towards the end of this month, and maybe hopefully they might even pick up on some of these ideas that we have heard here today. So and as Elana said, please be posted and follow our things. This is just the beginning, and hopefully we'll continue for some time. Thank you so much.
Next.